Hi, this is Tricia with Fangirl Chat, and we thought it would be fun to do some oral histories of fandom. And at Geek Girl Con last year, I met a wonderful lady, Maggie Nowakowska, and I thought I'd have her on. She's a longtime fan, and talk a little bit about her experience in fandom. Welcome, Maggie.
Thank you very much. I'm happy to be here.
I'm happy to have you here. I got to hear some stories briefly at Geek Girl Con, and we've exchanged some emails. Just to give people sort of where we are now. Today, everybody on the Internet saw, if you were on the Internet and Twitter and whatnot, that Bob Iger was doing a shareholder meeting, and he announced that the Episode 7 would be 30 years after Return of the Jedi in the setting, and would introduce a trio of new leads. I think, though, probably back when you were first getting introduced to Star Wars, information didn't quite come about the same way. So why don't you tell us, Maggie, about your first introduction to Star Wars?
Well, my first introduction to Star Wars was when I was working for a small publishing company out here, and we went down to the annual Library Association book fair, which was held in May, about the third week of May in 1977. And I had heard about the movie. I had seen a book on the stands called Star Wars, but I was working that weekend. So we went down, and we were on the mezzanine, and I looked right over Ballantine Books' huge setup. And there, standing in the middle of an aisle, was the tallest guy you could ever imagine in this big, huge black cape and outfit. Nobody knew about the movie. Nobody had seen the movie, but you could watch the people come down the aisle and walk far around him. They avoided him as much as possible because he was scary. And so I hurried home after that weekend, and I went to see the movie. And I remember sitting there saying, this is what I've been waiting for. I'd been a Trek fan. I'd been a Trek fan for many years. I'd written Trek literature before I knew anybody else was writing fan fiction. But I could never really put myself in the Trek universe. I couldn't imagine myself putting on one of the uniforms saying, yes, sir, to Captain Kirk. The closest I could ever get was imagining myself being a PR person for the Federation who didn't like Kirk but still had to write a nice fluff story about the Enterprise and Kirk. So when I saw Star Wars and I saw the Millennium Falcon, my favorite character, and I thought I could fit my whole library into that thing and still travel wherever I wanted to go.
That's a wonderful way to get introduced to it. And did you go read the book first, or did you go see the movie?
No, I didn't read the book first. I had been following some of the various magazines, and they had promo articles showing McQuarrie's artwork and their title Star Wars. And they had done a focus group or a survey, I don't remember which it was back in those days, about the name of the movie, and they had found out that the name of the movie Star Wars did not play well with women. And I have to admit, the name of the movie Star Wars, I thought to myself, oh God, just more robots and more bang bang shoot 'em ups, and I wasn't interested. But I was fascinated by the guy in the black suit, and I wanted to see what was going on. And so I went to see it, and having been a science fiction reader as long as I could read, I liked what I saw. I liked the mix of fantasy. Well, actually, it's not science fiction. It's science fantasy. I liked the mix of myth, and I enjoyed, well, like everybody else, the cinematography was wonderful. The clipping along of the story as it went, it was a lot of fun, and I could put myself in that universe. That was good.
So somewhere you wanted to be.
Yep.
Yes. So we're a lot of reasons why people love him. You obviously like Darth Vader.
No.
No. Or you were interested in him.
I was intrigued by it.
And then who were your favorite characters?
Obi-Wan. Obi-Wan was my first because I like history, I like philosophy, and my friends and I were sitting around trying to figure out the puzzle of Obi-Wan Kenobi, because that story he told Luke in the hut, we didn't believe it for a minute. And so we sat down and we started writing our stories that summer because we were trying to figure out how to write, how this could happen, what really was behind it all, in a way that we could accept as reality, sort of my friends and I now call the movie sort of the golden book version of what happened, and we like to write a realistic version of what really happened.
Okay. So you saw the movie with other friends?
Yes.
And what other ways for you as a fandom did you participate and learn about, what was to come and beyond after seeing the first movie?
Well, that summer I immediately started writing stories. I like writing histories. I like writing imaginative histories. I had done that in Star Trek fandom beforehand. I like writing universe-oriented type stories, exploring different planets and different ways people could live. So I started that summer, and I placed one story in a Star Trek zine, and then I was told about a woman in California who was putting together a Star Wars fanless zine. And I got in contact with her. She knew many people down in the science fiction community in California, many of whom went on to work in the business. And so she and I talked a lot, and she passed on a lot of the gossip and stories she heard. And she also, she knew some of the people who ended up working with the Star Wars fan, you wouldn't call it a fan club yet because it wasn't that yet, but fan liaison, shall we say, because they had been active in science fiction fandom. And it was that contact that she had with science fiction fandom that gave both of us an entree into the early days when it was a lot easier to talk with those people.
Right, a lot easier. Did you? And was this email? It wouldn't be emails. By mail? Were you making phone calls? How were you talking?
Phone calls and letters, both. Mostly letters because we were all broke, and we didn't have high-end jobs yet. We were in our mid to late 20s, and letters is what we had always done. I mean, people would write 10-page long letters. In those days, we'd throw out story ideas, we'd talk about politics in Star Wars and such, because that was the way you communicated in fandom. You had letter zines that went out, and if it was a good letter zine, it turned around in 2 months. And people would write their letters in, the editor would publish it, you would read it, you would write your answers back, and in 2 months you'd be able to continue the discussion, argument, conversation, whatever it was you were engaged with. And this is the only way we really had to communicate, because phones were very expensive. Long distance was expensive.
Oh, yes. Yes, I remember we had to be careful when I was young about how much time we spent on the phone, long distance. Did you feel as a female fan that you were welcome, or did you feel like there was that you were separated from the male fans?
It was a very interesting transition time. Many of the early Trek fans had been active in science fiction communities and just happened to also be interested in Trek. And there was a strong mix of male and female at the beginning. By the later 70s, it was becoming more oriented toward women, and they were the ones who were doing most of the zines. And so when Star Wars came around, there were a couple of gents. The very first general zine, which is not a fan fiction zine, but a commentary zine, what's happening, was called Hyperspace and put out by a young man whose name I did not write down. I thought I'd written down a bunch of names, but I forgot his. And then Jeff Johnson put out a letter zine called Alderaan. And people were talking universe and such. But by that point, Star Trek had an awful lot of fans who had not grown up reading science fiction. And there was a lot of conflict coming up between the Star Trek fans and the science fiction fans at conventions. You were hearing a lot of muttering from the science fiction fans that we have all these people here who don't read, they just watch TV. And then they're girls on top of it. And that got really, it got pretty sharp at times. And there were arguments and such. And when Star Wars came along, my friends and I, another reason we were writing stories is we wanted to make sure we got some female Jedi in there, because we were afraid the boys would get on it first, and next thing you'd know, women were never Jedi. And so we were determined to get our stories out there first, where there were plenty of women Jedi. But Star Wars was called a fringe fandom in those days because Star Trek was the media fandom. And so we were a fringe fandom. We were already writing fan fiction, so we were pretty locked into the female circles. There were some guys who were involved, but it was mostly female. And so when we went to science fiction cons, we just were included in the girls who like Star Trek people by the guys who were not happy that we were there. And the guys who weren't happy that in the masquerades there weren't as many nearly naked women showing up.
Oh, my.
1976 WesterCon masquerade was a bit of a scandal. One of the female judges walked off during the middle of the masquerade. One of the male judges was very loud about the fact that there wasn't enough skin showing. And this was still bleeding over into Star Wars fandom in the late 70s and early 80s.
Well, we still have those conversations sometimes.
Yes, isn't that something?
Some of the stories sound familiar. So when Empire Strikes Back comes out, and you've written written fic and speculated about Obi-Wan, how did you and your friends receive Empire Strikes Back?
That was very interesting. We had long talks about it. I remember sitting there and watching it, and my mind immediately going, oh, no, that's not what happened. And then I had to laugh at myself, because this is George's movie, and he's telling me what happened. The concept of alternate universes was already established in fan fiction media fandom, where people in Star Trek knew that the canon, shall we say, what was on TV went one direction, but they wanted to take it another direction. They called it an alternate universe, and they kept on writing. And so my stories, of which there really were a couple thousand manuscript pages by that time, just became alternate history. And it didn't bother me that much. George could tell his story, I could tell my story. The first movie for me was The Archetype. It said, here's the universe. It didn't tell us a whole lot about it. It just told us about one event in it. It told us about some relationships, but it didn't tell us a whole lot about those. And we spent the first 3 years writing all kinds of speculations, all kinds of universes, all kinds of political setups. Were the Sith really bad, or was just Darth a bad Sith? Was the Empire really bad? There was a large contingent of fans who came down on the side that the Empire was the legitimate authority because the Republic was falling down on the job.
Well, that's sort of what the Clone Wars ended up, the TV show.
Yeah, yes, and it was fun in those first few years because, like I said earlier, you could talk to the guys a lot more easily. They would come up to NorwestCon, which is our regional science fiction con out here, and you'd end up sitting in a back room with the director of Jedi, and with about 20 other fans and doing trivia. He'd sit there and say, okay, does everybody know what the Emperor's name is? And most of the people didn't, and I raised my hand and said Palpatine, and we went from there. But our ideas of Palpatine were different, and that was when Lawrence Kasdan was still Larry Kasdan when we went to film seminars and such. We had lunch with him at a local film seminar out here, which was a predecessor to the Seattle Film Festival, which is now known worldwide. And we had lunch with him, and he was telling us all about having to take Leigh Brackett's script for Empire and finish it. And then having discussions with George of what George liked and what Larry liked. Larry wanted to play a lot more on Chewbacca's jealousy of Leia. She's taking up too much time of my friends. We aren't hanging out together like we were. George didn't like that idea. So you only get slight hints of it, as you watch the movie, especially once you know that Kasdan wanted to do that. Yes,
very interesting. That's cool, different take. I could see, yeah, that could be an element, because Han and Chewie were great friends, and this other, woman's tagging along.
Well, she was taking him away from, Chewie. They were talking. He probably knew much more what was on Han's mind than Han knew. You often know your friends and where they're going in relationships before they do.
So what did you feel about Princess Leia compared to, say, other women that you were seeing on film and,
She kicked ass. I remember sitting there in the movie the very first time, and she and Luke are escaping, and they get to the big shaft, and they have to swing across it. And I'm sitting there going, my God, they not only let her have a gun, they let her shoot it. And not only did they let her shoot it, they let her hit somebody. This was very unusual back then.
It is true. Did you want to see her become a full-fledged Jedi? Were you disappointed that you never saw that on screen?
No, she's a politician.
She's a politician.
I wanted her a hardcore politician. I wanted that to be her interest. She apparently took over from her father when she was about 16 or 17. And she must have had interest in it, whether it was an emotional interest behind the rebellion or because that was what Dad did, and she's his kid, so that's what she's going to do. But I always played Leia, and I wrote her as basically a politician. She would go on to become one of the presidents of the New Republic in my stories. That's what she did. That was her career.
And did you go on and read the Expanded Universe novels?
I did some of them, and I stopped.
Which ones did you read that you can recall?
Well, let's see, I read one of the early ones. The one where she was supposed to marry the other guy.
Courtship of Princess Leia.
Yes.
Yeah.
And then there was one that all I remember is one scene out of it where Leia and Han and the kids are sitting down to what I read as a nice suburban dinner. And that was when I put the book down.
You didn't want to see them be normal?
She was raised by a guy who was the viceroy of Alderaan. Now this is another argument we had in the early days of fandom. You'd have those of us who read history and such, and perhaps who were a little older than some of the other fans, and we would say this is a person who has been watched and been playing in court political games all her life. You cannot write her as a suburban housewife.
Well, that's a fair characterization argument.
Well, that was one of the big ones we had. Fandom in the early days, and I'm sure it still happens now, but I was 28 when I saw Star Wars. Now, granted, I was a nerd. I read science fiction since first grade when I read Space Cat on Venus. My mom wanted me to be the first woman on the moon, and if I couldn't manage that, she wanted me to be a nuclear physicist. She had read Doc Savage and all the science fiction in the 30s herself. So I came to Star Wars with a slightly different background than somebody who was perhaps a few years younger. 8 years younger, perhaps still in school. I liked Leia because she wasn't like the women in all the other movies. She was an integral part of the story. She snapped at people exactly when I would expect her to snap at people. And I liked that. It was refreshing to see on TV. On the movies. Sorry.
Now, when the movies, the original trilogy comes and goes, and we end up here with the prequel trilogies.
Yep.
Did you go see them right when they came out?
Sure. Oh, sure. Like I said, when Empire came out, I simply transferred the Star Wars on screen to George's alternate universe, and as a difference in my alternate universe. So it never really bugged me that much what he did. I might disagree with it, or I might not think he did as good a job as he could have. But it was better than some of the fanlit I read. Not as good as others, but I could go with it. And the first movies came out, and I have some disagreements with the way he took the stories. I've had some areas where I think he made some mistakes and could have done it better. But on the whole, I was ready for them because I saw Jedi, Return of the Jedi, and you saw the, excuse my language, the boys playing with their toys perhaps a little bit more than they ought to have, and putting the story aside for their special effects.
Sure.
And they did it in Jedi. And things were so new in making films back then that I have always been able to understand. I mean, George and these guys are the ones who invented the Steadicam. These are the guys who made all the early prototypes of what became the special effects that we assume we're going to see now. Bev Clark, who was the editor of Skywalker, that zine I was talking about earlier, we got to know the guy who did the rotoscoping on R2-D2. Didn't know him for very long because he tragically died young. But this was wild and wiki stuff for them. We had never seen anything like this before. As far as being able to visualize a universe on the screen, Star Wars was a paradigm shifter. The kind that once it shifts, nobody can ever really imagine what it was like beforehand, or believe their older brothers and sisters or their parents about what it was really like, because it just doesn't seem possible. Of course we can do all this.
I just chuckled because when you mentioned having, going and meeting with Larry and Irvin Kershner, the directors aren't generally that accessible to fans anymore. We would see them at a big event up on a stage, and they would get have people come up to the mic and ask them questions, maybe, but not on a personal level.
Well, it was very different because I have to remember this was before Creation Cons even came around. The Creation Cons came in the 70s, but you didn't have these really big cons with the stars and everybody coming. You had fan cons where fans would get together and talk about their stories, sell their art and show their art, and just generally sit around and gossip and talk about their favorite films and their favorite characters. You didn't have stars coming in to put a wedge between you. You didn't even have VCRs yet. There were many of us who complained about when VCRs started showing up in hotel rooms. People would haul their big, huge, honking VCRs, wait a ton, and connect them to the hotel TV. And instead of everybody sitting around talking about stories, suddenly they were watching the TV show again, this being Trek, shall we say. And instead of people having to remember what they saw, and perhaps not remembering correctly, but flying off on a creative binge over something that they thought they remembered, you had people saying, no, this is what really happened, because I can backtrack, I can reverse this and show you. And it changed fandom. It changed fandom a great deal. Yeah.
It ended up, nowadays we talk a lot about the Wikipedia, where people are more interested in watching the shows or reading the books simply to get the facts down in a sort of a same type of thing, instead of just sort of absorbing the story for what it is and how it makes you feel. And
it's a different story for them.
Yeah.
It's a very different story. When I do get into discussions with some folks about this, I say the first time you saw Star Wars is what Star Wars really is for you. If it was Empire, if it was Jedi, if it was the prequels, the Clone Wars, or the books, that's what Star Wars is for you. Nobody can take it away from you, but that doesn't mean your fellow fans will see it the same way. And I think that's the strength of Star Wars, is that first movie is simply set a certain point in time. You know how in Doctor Who they say there are certain points in time that don't change?
Yes.
That's what the first movie was for me. The first time you fall in love with Star Wars from whatever source, that's your first unchangeable point in time. Lucas said it to Jon Stewart very well on The Daily Show, because Jon Stewart's a fan. And Lucas sat down, and John immediately got into him about some of the changes. And started talking about Empire, and he told his kids, no, this is what really happened, this is not really happening. George stopped him. He said, you realize, of course, that the young kids know what Star Wars is the Clone Wars. Many of them haven't even seen the first trilogy. What they know of is the Clone Wars. He says, you can't say that to your kids because that's not Star Wars to them. And he said it very gently. You could tell that he had heard this before. And I think he was absolutely right. So I try not to get into arguments about canon anymore. I do have my T-shirt that says, damn right I shot first. But that's my Star Wars.
That is true.
many years ago, there was another argument that fans had years ago. Was Han really a badass who reformed? Or is he just a nice boy who was playing with the bad boys? And if you wrote a story where he was a hard ass and needed to work his way slowly into a nicer world, your story didn't please people who thought he was somebody who smuggled Band-Aids, she said sarcastically, because now you know which side I was on. A lot of the stuff I see now and I hear now, it was talked about in the first 3 years of Star Wars. And then in the next 3 years, the first 6 years. So that's those 6 years between the first movie and the last movie. A lot of the points that are proving eternal, as far as disagreements go, are still there.
That would seem that way. And were you, as you were experiencing movies, did you want to know more? Did you want to be spoiled about stuff, or were you just ready to take the ride? And because nowadays sometimes you just don't really have that choice about being spoiled about stuff. If you turn on Entertainment Tonight, you'll probably see something.
This is true, and as a creative person myself, I find it discouraging because sometimes when you make a story, you want somebody to be surprised. In one of my longer stories, I had a character who apparently died. In fact, my editor, who had only seen that part of the story so far, was very shocked when she got the last part of the story and found out that, no, I managed to keep him alive. That's neat when you can do that. And yet, again, that's what I enjoy. I like being surprised. I look at some of it, but I don't read the last page of a book. And I, told Susan not to tell me if she's read some of the information or some of the stuff that shows up on Facebook, because I enjoy being surprised. I enjoy being delighted. That's what it is. I delight in that. But, you can write a story and you can end it where you feel it needs to end, and you'll have any number of readers who will come up and say, what happened next? You insinuated that he's going to meet these other people or do this other thing. And I say, yes, but that's another story.
Another story.
They want to have every string knotted at the end of that story.
So when you were writing your fiction, your fanfic, you had an editor who worked with you?
It all depended on the zine. Some editors and some zines merely did copy editing, checking for spelling, punctuation, and sentences that made no sense. But you would every once in a while have an editor who could do a really full writer's edit with you. The example I use is one page I got back, and Bev had written down, highlighted about 3 paragraphs and said, this is lovely. This is beautiful. I'm glad I know this. Can you save it for another story? Because it will slow things down. And I like working with that kind of an editor. I work with other friends editing their stories, but not everybody does it that way. And one thing about fandom that's, going off a little bit, veering off a little to the side, you learn through working with people all over the country and all over the world how differently people approach their writing, their storytelling, and what areas are not negotiable.
Yep.
I remember a big, well, not a big hoo-ha, but enough that a lot of letters were written, in that somebody had taken some fan stories from some folks from the continent, and she had done basically a copy edit, but she had made some comments that this makes no sense, could you please change this? And the writer was absolutely livid, because that wasn't her job. You print what the writer wrote, and then the writer takes the knock. And so we had a lot of going back and forth in fandom about that, trying to... A friend of mine who was Hungarian, who had lived in America now, played go-between, explaining to the European person that in America they have a different perception of editing, and explaining to the American person that in Europe they have a different approach to writing. And this is one of the wonderful things about fandom, and one of the ways that I think the internet has been really great, because you have much more of the immediate talking, like we're doing now. It was typing back in the old days, but I remember I was in communication with a fan from a very rural area in a very rural part of the country. And she had grown up in a town where everybody was one religion, maybe different flavors, different denominations, but it was basically one religion. And she had never met anybody who wasn't of that religion until she got involved in Star Wars fandom. And suddenly she was talking to people all over the country and discovering that people she liked didn't live at all the way she did. And I've seen this happen a lot in fandom. It was a wonderful way, especially for women, especially back in the 70s, when an awful lot of us were still extremely sheltered. Never wrote a check, didn't drive. Dad took care of all that, but my mom never did it.
Right.
Didn't know anything about legal aspects. And they were plunging into fanzine publishing, which had to do with money and deadlines and people who wanted to get something for their money. And there were a lot of women who honestly just didn't know how to do that.
So you're learning some life lessons too. I remember I met through, it was one of the fellow fanfic writers. I never really understood Anakin in the prequel trilogies at first. I had a hard time grasping, and she just seemed to get him and write about him in this beautiful way that sort of expounded on the character and made you, and it all fit in with the movies. It all made sense. And I was talking to her off, not in public, in private discussion, and she just said that Anakin was essentially her son. That's why she felt compassion for the character and wrote, even though she wrote him as, truly Anakin having, his fall to the dark side and stuff, she felt for him and was very compassionate about how the character experienced it, which helped me understand the character, because she just did such a good job of making him relatable and real.
Yes. Yeah.
Even in it was a superhero. So that was, one way it was really cool as a, in the fandom to have someone that could actually explain to you why a character clicked for them and how it worked out so well for them, and to be able to, turn it around and make you go, okay, I see now, and then now I look at his character differently, and through her eyes, but it all fit in the context of the movies, how she related his character.
Yeah, it's really very interesting to do that. One of the stories I tell people when we're talking about the movie and how it affected people, I didn't invent this, I was told this by another friend, who said that she had observed that at the end of Jedi, the third movie, where that some people just rolled with what happened. That was cool, Luke discovering about Vader being Anakin and all this. There were some people who absolutely loved the ending, really got into the Luke and Vader business, and some people who absolutely hated it. And she had noticed, looking among her friends and who loved, hated, and was indifferent, that the people who had had problems with their parents and who had come to terms with that were the ones who really loved the ending. And those who had had problems with their parents and who were still fighting those problems at 20, 30, 40 years old were the ones who really hated the ending. And we had a long discussion after that about how people relate to, shall we say, disappointing parents. And I could identify with that because there was one aspect of that I hated. I hated the fact that Anakin died being more interested in what his daughter thought about him than anything Luke was saying to him. And Anakin solved his problem, and then he potted off. Good for Anakin, lousy for Luke. And it really bugged me until I stopped. Well, actually, until my mother died. And my mother did pretty much the same thing. Pop dropped dead one day, had been a difficult mother, a very difficult mother, and the day before she died, she told a woman she knew that she had decided to turn over a new leaf and become a different person. And then she died the next day. And my feeling was very much the same thing. Well, good for her. Lousy for me and my brother. And once I realized that, and I only would have realized it through watching the movie, I was happy with it because it helped place this in a understandable realm, like you talking about Anakin.
Yeah, absolutely. That's what the we bring our own life experiences to the movie, so it's interesting how so many people can connect with the myth and the characters.
Yes. You've probably heard people complain about Obi-Wan lying to Luke, not telling him who his father was. And we had a friend who had a very young, early marriage to somebody who, as she said herself, was very much like a bad Han. You know, the Han who didn't want to be redeemed. And so she divorced him because she was tired of being on the wrong end of the stick. But she was pregnant. And she met somebody, and she fell in love with him, and they got together, and they got married before the baby was even born. And she never, ever told her son that man was not his father. And I asked her about it. I said, well, you've heard the people talking in fandom, because she was a fan also. And she said, yeah, she's heard it, and she didn't change her mind one bit. She would never, ever tell her son that this bad guy was his father. And there's a real life approach.
Yeah. Oh no! It's always the big debate among fans was whether Obi-Wan walking away on the lava bank and not running Anakin through was the correct thing to do, and whether that was an Obi-Wan thing to do, or whether it was a Jedi thing to do, or whether it was what he should have done. So I always love how people sort of took the different approach, and they felt very strongly.
Yes. Well, I always thought it was just a very human thing to do. The way Ewan McGregor plays it, the emotion in the frustration when he says, I love you. And I just saw it as a very human thing. But then again, you get into that argument as to whether Jedi are human with people.
Yes.
And so yes, there's a lot of that goes on. Now I was thinking of something and I was going to mention it. I can't remember it now. There's so much to talk about. I did want to go back a little bit to the boys and girls in fandom aspect. I was really surprised when online I saw how few young women were participating in some of the early, the movie's coming out soon, discussion threads. There were a lot of interesting things the boys were saying, but there weren't that many young women. And it reminded me of going back to when you could still talk to people. Bev hearing through her lines of communication down south that, in a way, Gary, Kirsten, and Lucas knew about the fanzines. They didn't mind them. They were familiar with fanzines, and as a matter of fact, Skywalker was the theme that Gary Kurtz took to 20th Century Fox to demonstrate that this fanzine was not going to destroy their profit margin. But they had expected the fanzines to be more like articles, discussions of the force, talking about the ships, sort of thing. And they hadn't anticipated that the fanzines would be so storytelling oriented. And so perhaps right from the very beginning there was a difference there, because most of the women I know wrote stories and most of the guys I know wrote articles.
Well, that's still pretty.
Yeah.
The way it is. I mean, there are men who in fan fiction, but it's mostly you'll see women writing the stories, which is always an interesting dynamic to see when you get to the professional side, that there's where all the men telling the stories just for fun, all of a sudden they're all male pros and you can't find the female writers. It's an interesting dynamic to see happen. It seems to be getting better, and we have more women telling stories, and in all types of sci-fi fantasy. So that's fun to see.
Yes. As a fan who really likes universes, that's what I like to read in science fiction, and that's what I like to about the Star Wars fandom to a great extent. We're in the minority. We always have been. Most people want to talk about the people and the relationships. So I sort of feel like I exist in an area between the boys and the girls.
That's all right. And are you still I know you went to Geek Girl Con. Is there other ways that you participate in fandom now still? I
do some editing for some friends who are still writing, and I help I do some writing with them. I still noodle along with some of the stories I wrote and the universe I wrote. I went through a couple phases with my fan list. I had established my universe in the 3 years between A New Hope and Empire, and finished off one story arc almost completely, and then I picked up trying to do some short stories that were straight Star Wars, based on the movies, and I published those into early 90s, and then I sort of faded a little. We go to science fiction cons, but a lot of it was going off in areas that I wasn't that interested in. They were curiosity. I liked watching them, but I wasn't deeply interested in them. I'd spend hours and hours. And the world changed a great deal. I mean, Star Wars changed the way we approach the movies. I came out of the Twilight Zone, the Day the Earth Stood Still media universe of science fiction. Star Trek was our paradigm shifter. I mean, I find it very difficult sometimes to watch the original classic Star Trek, because I'm sitting there giggling and laughing at all all what seems odd to me these days. Did you think communicators were going to work like that? But Star Trek broke an awful lot of ice. Even Isaac Asimov had an article printed in the TV Guide where he couldn't understand why the women liked Spock. The idea of having an alien like Spock who was a real sentient being, not just a them, or somebody to wrap a plot around. When you watched Outer Limits, the aliens were almost always the bad guys.
Right.
Twilight Zone wavered back and forth. And suddenly in Star Trek you had an alien who was a good guy. A little odd, a little bit not like us, but he was a good guy. And that shifted things just the way Star Wars shifted when you had Leia shooting and actually killing stormtroopers instead of screaming.
She was a good shot, too.
Yes.
She was.
Yes.
Well, Maggie, it's been great talking with you. This is so much going to be so helpful for, I think, other fans to see how the fandom is so much the same and different in different ways.
Yes.
But that people, that you could be a longtime fan and still be in it. I love that you talk about just the alternate universes. We have this sort of generation now that's so used to this one canon of Star Wars. That's how it was presented. The books and the TV shows and the movies are all one canon. But having been in the fanfic community as well, I'm used to that sort of alternate universe. I know comic books tell stories that way. It's not always going to be the same. So, I know there's a lot in the fandom, people in my generation that, have a little bit of, they're a little stressed about what changes may come. But I think, if you've experienced enough Star Wars stories of different types, you can have fun in all different types of stories. So
Yes. It's yours to play with. George wanted to give people a fairy tale, and he did.
Yeah. Exactly. So appreciate your time, and this will go up in probably the next couple of weeks when we get it rolled up into the right format to load up onto the blog. And hopefully sometime we can have you back on to talk about Star Wars again. Maybe when we get closer to the movie and people are getting really excited about it.
Yes, I'm very curious to see if people are going, how a lot of people said, I don't want to watch a 10-year-old, even if his name is Skywalker. I'm wondering very much if people are going to say, I don't want to watch a 60-year-old, even if his name is Han.
Well, we'll soon find out, at least, how that's going to be. So it could, it'll be interesting. It'll be interesting to see what, what J.J. Abrams thinks that we as fans want to see from Star Wars going forward.
Another whole session of talking.
Yeah, exactly.
Thank you for
exactly.
Me, Tricia. I really appreciate it, and I look forward to hearing what other people say because it's always a person's individual fandom.
Exactly.